Today, we're continuing with our beginner novel writing series. Last week, we talked about the elements that go towards making up a story and how to figure out what your story is about. I will link to part 1 in all the places. Today, we're going to be focused on one of the hardest parts of writing a novel for a lot of beginners, getting through the first draft. We've all been there. You're full of enthusiasm, you've got a great idea, but your first draft just doesn't seem to do it justice. The truth is, a great novel rarely springs to life during a first draft. Usually great works don't emerge until after a lot of polishing and revision. Your focus on the first draft, especially if you're a new writer, should be on finishing the book, not worrying about writing a great book. You can work later on making it into a great book, but in order to do that, you need to start with a draft. My goal today is not to force you into any one method, but rather to talk about some different methods writers use to bring their stories together through the drafting phase. My goal is to help you find a method that works for you so you can complete your first draft and help you through some of the common pitfalls that happen when you're writing a first draft. So with that, here are 3 tips for getting through your first draft for new writers. Tip number 1, do some planning, or don't. For a lot of writers, knowing where the story is going is crucial to getting through a first draft. Outlining or pre-draft planning comes in a lot of different forms. For some, it might be a complex scene-by-scene breakdown of the story they plan to write. Others might use a more concise set of notes. Some people like flowcharts and diagrams. Still others might use nothing at all. We'll talk about that in a minute. Making an outline beforehand or rushing into a draft with just an idea and seeing where it goes are 2 different ways to approach your draft. I would argue, and I could be totally wrong here, that for new writers, getting through an entire novel-length draft without any guidance or planning is going to be difficult. Until you've got some experience and some understanding of how plot and characters play out, writing a novel from just an idea could be problematic. Now, that's not true for everyone. Some writers will find an outline to be confining, and it may actually hinder your ability to finish your draft. Everyone is going to be different, and you won't know what method you prefer until you start writing. Hell, even then, it might take you some time to figure out. My advice is to start out with whatever method feels right. Or failing that, just pick one at random. Maybe map out the major beats of your story beforehand in a simple outline, and then start writing the draft once you feel you've got a good idea of where you want the story to go. If you're itching to start writing but still feel more comfortable with an outline, you could maybe try doing some free writes. This is where you write a short scene to explore a character or a setting just to get a feel for what you want in the story. The scene may or may not actually end up in the story, but this exercise can help you in the outlining process. It also sort of bridges the gap between discovery writing and outlining. Remember, you can always go back and change your outline partway through a draft, or if you discover writing from an outline isn't your thing, you can just abandon the outline entirely. Don't feel the need to do all the planning up front. It's perfectly acceptable to stop partway through a draft to either change your outline or add more detail to it if you feel you've written yourself into a corner or you're not really sure the story is going in the right direction. Adjusting your plan as you go isn't usually a problem. But you know what sometimes is? Tip number 2, don't edit the draft as you go. This is oft repeated advice that probably borders a bit on cliche, but I still think it's worth repeating. When it comes to the first draft, you should resist the temptation to go back and change or rewrite earlier scenes until you've finished the draft. The idea behind this advice is that if you're constantly going back to edit, then you might never actually finish. And as I mentioned before, finishing the draft should be your main objective. This means that you may have to leave some plot holes in earlier scenes. You may have scenes you feel aren't written well. You might have blatant grammar mistakes staring back at you every time you scroll through your document. As tempting as it is to go back and fix all this stuff, don't let any of it worry you. As I mentioned before, there will be an opportunity to go back through once the draft is completed. And with a completed first draft, you'll likely have a better idea of what needs to be changed anyway. Some writers like to keep track of changes they know they need to make as they go, adding them to a sort of revision guide. This can ensure that you don't forget anything that you know you need to fix, like foreshadowing a certain plot development or mentioning an element of a character's backstory, so that when you do get to revision, you have something to work from. Although again, make sure that this doesn't spiral too much. Don't spend too much time writing notes about things you need to fix in your draft before you've actually finished the draft. Even if you're writing from an outline, you may not know what your story needs until the first draft is complete. Going back to fix things you feel need fixing before it's actually determined that they need fixing in the first place isn't a great idea, and it's probably a waste of time. A lot of times when people feel the need to go back and edit a draft before it's complete, it's because they haven't set the proper expectations for that first draft. Tip number 3, remember to set the proper expectations for your first draft. I feel like I said that already. It's real talk time, as the millennials like to say. Wait, I'm a millennial. The first draft of your first book is not going to turn out the way you'd hoped, and that's perfectly okay. Weaving together the nuances of character and plot, understanding how to communicate clearly and eloquently through prose, and how to navigate the different parts of plot takes years and many, many attempts and rewrites. Expecting your first draft to come out like a bestseller or like one of the stories that inspired you to write in the first place is a recipe for disappointment. Talk to any great writer, and 9 times out of 10 you'll learn that they spent years honing and perfecting their craft and practicing before they wrote the stories that they're known for. It is very rare for someone to be a great writer without putting the time in, and a lot of that time, especially early on, is going to be spent on writing that you may not be that happy with. I've seen different people quote that you need to write like 1,000,000 bad words until you start writing well. I don't know that it's that quantifiable, but I think the essence of that advice is true. You'll spend a lot of time producing writing that doesn't live up to your expectations, and it's only through investing that time that you'll see improvement. Keep in mind that your first novel and probably your first few novels are going to be a learning experience. You're going to make mistakes, the writing might be poor in places, but as long as you focus on finishing those projects, you will eventually improve. If the first go-around doesn't measure up, then don't worry. Keep writing, keep learning, and you'll start to see improvements with time. Just like the time you spent watching this video was an improvement on the time that you weren't watching this video. There's probably some room for improvement with that transition to the conclusion. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. Next week, we're going to continue with our beginner novel writing series that I still haven't come up with a pithy name for yet. I want to talk next week a bit more about writer's block and motivation and some of what we've talked about today, but go into it in a bit more detail. Until then, I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. I post new videos every Wednesday. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.